my name is Salvatore Esposito. Everyone in the Quartieri Spagnoli has called me Toto since I was 4 years old, when I fell into a fountain in Piazza Carità, and my grandfather pulled me out by the back of my shirt and named me after the comedian because I was crying with my mouth open the same way Toto did in his films. I am 80 years old now. I live in a small apartment 3 streets above the bakery, in a building that was built in 1874 and has never had a working elevator. For 51 years, I worked the brick oven at Panificio Esposito on Via Toledo in Naples, the bakery my father Antonio built with his own hands from the rubble of the German bombings, the bakery I sold to a young couple from Milan 3 months ago. They are kind people. They paid more than the shop was worth. They are turning it into a wine bar, and they have promised to keep the brass plate above the door, the one that reads, Panificio Esposito, pane fresco ogni giorno. Fresh bread every day. My father had it engraved in 1946, with money he did not have. Before the renovation begins next month, I went into the back office to clear out my father's old wooden receipt drawer. It is the kind of drawer with 1,000 small slips of paper inside, each one a record of a loaf, or a wedding cake, or a tray of sfogliatelle sold sometime in the last 79 years. I sat on a small stool in the back room. I poured the receipts out onto the floor in piles. I sorted them by year. I was not looking for anything. I was simply doing what a son does when he closes the door on his father's life for the last time. Taped to the underside of the drawer, not inside it, underneath it, where no one would look unless they were taking the drawer apart, I found a single bread receipt. The receipt was dated the 23rd of March, 1972. It was for 1 loaf of pane cafone, Neapolitan country bread, at 90 lire. It was unpaid. It had never been rung up. My father had never charged the customer. On the back of the receipt, in pencil, in handwriting that was not my father's, was one Italian word, custodisci. It means, keep watch, guard, protect. Carry this until I come for it. I sat on that stool with the receipt in my hand for a long time. My knees ached. The pile of receipts on the floor around me had a strange smell, the smell of old ink and old flour and old cigarette smoke from a man who had smoked his last Nazionale in 1989 and quit the next morning when his wife told him she was tired of washing his shirts. I am telling this story now because the small Chinese gentleman who ordered that loaf of bread on the morning of the 23rd of March, 1972, walked out of my father's shop without paying. And the reason he did not pay was that in the 8 seconds it took me to wrap the loaf in brown paper and reach for the twine, he had to walk across Via Toledo and stop 2 men in a black Fiat from pulling a woman into the back seat. The woman was Sophia Loren. I am 80 years old. My father died in 2011 at the age of 97. He took the secret of that morning with him. For 53 years, I have kept it the way he kept it. I am telling it now because the bakery is closing, and because Sophia Loren is still alive in Geneva with her grandsons, and because the small gentleman is not, and someone in this world should know what happened on a Thursday morning in spring, on a narrow street in the Quartieri Spagnoli. The Beverly Hilton in 1972 was the center of Hollywood, the way that no single hotel is the center of anything anymore. Conrad Hilton himself had opened it in 1955. The Golden Globes had been held there every January since 1961. Frank Sinatra had a regular table in the Escoffier room. Merv Griffin taped his show in the building next door and walked through our lobby twice a day with a cigarette in his left hand and a coffee in his right. Reagan, when he was still governor, came for fundraising lunches. Howard Hughes had once stayed for 9 days in a suite on the 8th floor and never opened the curtains. I was 25 years old that February. I had been at the Hilton for 3.5 years. I wore the maroon uniform with the gold piping and the cap that did not quite fit me because my head was too narrow. I carried bags, I called taxis, I told men where the best steak in Los Angeles was. It was at the Hilton's own L'Escoffier room, and the chef gave me $5 a week to say so. I knew every elevator in the building by sound. The North Bank elevators had a higher motor whine because they had been replaced in 1969 after a small fire. The South Bank elevators, the original 1955 cars, had a deep mechanical hum and a small shudder when they passed the 3rd floor. The brass interior panels were polished every Monday and Thursday by a man named Ernesto, who did nothing else with his life. The walnut paneling on the back wall had a slight imperfection, a knot in the wood about chest high, that I had stared at 10,000 times while riding up to deliver luggage. Friday, the 11th of February, 1972, was a warm afternoon for February in Los Angeles. 68 degrees, a thin layer of smog over the Hollywood Hills. The hotel was running at 91% occupancy because the National Association of Broadcasters convention was finishing the next day. At 3:14 in the afternoon, a black 1971 Cadillac Fleetwood pulled into the porte cochere. I knew the car. Every bellhop in Los Angeles knew the car. It belonged to a driver named Gianni, and Gianni drove Elizabeth Taylor. She had been staying at the Hilton for 9 days. She was in suite 904, a corner suite on the 9th floor with a view of the Hollywood sign. She was in town for what we were told were private meetings related to a film project. She had been seen at Chasen's twice that week, at Romanoff's once, and at a small dinner at George Cukor's house in the Hills. Richard Burton was not with her. They were in one of their separation periods, the third one by my count, and she was traveling alone. She was 39 years old in February of 1972. She had won 2 Academy Awards. She had been married 5 times to 4 different men. She wore, that afternoon, a pale grey wool coat over a black turtleneck, dark trousers, and black leather flats. Her hair was tied back. She wore no makeup that I could see, and she did not need any. On her right wrist, half hidden by the cuff of her coat, was a diamond bracelet. I would learn later, from the police report I read in 1985, that the bracelet contained 47 diamonds set in platinum, weighed 218 grams, and had been a gift from Mike Todd in 1957, 15 years before the day I am describing, and only 7 months before Mike Todd died in a plane crash. It was the only piece of jewelry she was wearing. She got out of the Cadillac. She nodded to me. She always nodded to me. She never spoke much in the lobby. She had learned over 20 years of fame that a single word in a hotel lobby becomes a paragraph in the Hollywood Reporter. But she nodded, and her eyes met mine. And for a half second, the most famous violet eyes in the world looked at a 25-year-old bellhop and registered him as a human being. She walked toward the South Bank elevator. She did not see the man following her from across the lobby. I did. He had been sitting in the lobby for 1 hour and 40 minutes. I had noticed him at 1:35 because he ordered a cup of coffee from the lobby bar and then did not drink it. A bellhop notices these things. People who order coffee and do not drink it are either nervous, watching for someone, or both. He was perhaps 34 years old. He wore a brown corduroy jacket that did not fit him well across the shoulders, a beige shirt, and dark trousers. His shoes were brown loafers, scuffed. His hair was thinning on top. He had a moustache that he kept touching with the index finger of his right hand, a tic, something he did unconsciously every 40 or 50 seconds. He carried a small canvas messenger bag over his left shoulder. In the bag, I would learn later, was a notebook containing 14 months of entries about Elizabeth Taylor, newspaper clippings dating back to 1969, a copy of her itinerary for that week, God knows how he had obtained it, a photograph of the door of suite 904, and a letter, 4 pages long, handwritten, that he had been working on for 6 weeks. He did not have a weapon. The police would search him afterward and find no weapon. This is important. He was not a man who came to hurt her with a knife or a gun. He was something more confusing than that, and in some ways something more frightening. A man who had decided, in the privacy of his own mind, that he and Elizabeth Taylor had a relationship that needed to be discussed in person. When she walked through the lobby toward the elevator, he stood up. He left his untouched coffee on the table. He did not look at her directly. He looked at the floor, then at the elevator doors, then at the floor again. He walked behind her at a distance of about 6 meters. I watched all of this from my bellhop station near the front desk. I felt something turn cold in my stomach. The kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and know, before anything visible has happened, that something is wrong. I started to move. I do not know what I was planning to do. I was 25 years old, 1 meter 78 centimeters, 68 kilograms. I had never been in a fight in my life, but I started to move toward the elevator. I was 12 meters away when she reached the South Bank elevator. She pressed the call button. The doors opened immediately. The car had been sitting on the lobby level. She stepped in. She turned to face the doors. She pressed the button for the 9th floor. The man in the brown jacket stepped in 2 seconds later. He stood at the back of the elevator, against the walnut paneling, his eyes on the floor. She did not look at him. She was looking at the doors. She had no reason to think anything was wrong. I shouted, "Miss Taylor!" But the doors closed before the word was finished. The doors closed on her at 3:18 and 22 seconds, post-meridium, on Friday the 11th of February, 1972. I started to run toward the staircase, but two things happened in the next 11 seconds that I did not see, and that I have reconstructed from one source, the small Chinese gentleman himself, who told me 3 pieces of it in the lobby 7 minutes later, and from a single conversation I had with Elizabeth Taylor in 1985, 13 years afterward, in a Beverly Hills restaurant where she remembered my face and asked me to sit down. The elevator rose from the lobby toward the 9th floor at a speed of approximately 1.5 meters per second. It was an old elevator. It would take roughly 22 seconds to reach floor 9. Between the lobby and the 3rd floor, nothing happened. Elizabeth Taylor stood facing the doors. The man in the brown jacket stood at the back, facing her shoulders, his hands flat against the walnut paneling behind him. At the 3rd floor, which the elevator passed without stopping, the man spoke for the first time. He said her name. She did not turn around. She had heard her name spoken by strangers 10,000 times in her life. The instinct of a famous woman is not to turn at the sound of her own name. The instinct is to keep facing forward and hope the voice does not require an answer. The man said her name again, this time louder. This time with an emotion in it that was not admiration. It was something else, a kind of demand. The kind of voice that says, "Acknowledge me." She turned then. She turned because she understood, in the way that famous women learn to understand within a half second, that she was alone in an elevator with a man whose voice had just gone past the line. What he said next, she repeated to me word for word in 1985. She said, "He told me he had been writing to me for 14 months, and I had never answered. He told me I owed him an answer. He said the answer was on his wrist." He raised his left hand. There was nothing on his wrist. He meant her wrist. He meant the bracelet. She told me, 13 years later, in that Beverly Hills restaurant, with her hand around a glass of ice water that she did not drink. She told me that in that moment, she understood 3 things simultaneously. The first was that the man was not entirely in control of himself. The second was that the elevator was passing the 4th floor, and she had 8 floors to go. The third was that the bracelet on her wrist was the only thing in the elevator that mattered to him, and if she gave it to him, she would walk out of the elevator alive. She started to unclasp the bracelet. Her fingers, Elizabeth Taylor's famous, beautiful ringed fingers, were shaking so badly that she could not work the clasp. The man stepped forward. He reached for her wrist, and at that exact moment, 3:18 and 41 seconds, post-meridium, by the brass clock above the South Bank elevator panel, the elevator stopped at floor 4. Someone had pressed the call button on floor 4. The doors opened. I have to describe him exactly as I saw him later in the lobby, because everyone reading this is going to want to know how he looked. And I am going to disappoint you by telling you that the most extraordinary thing about him was how ordinary he looked. He was small, 1 meter 71 centimeters, 63 kilograms, maybe 64. He wore black trousers, a dark grey turtleneck, a tweed blazer, and brown leather shoes that had walked through rain at some point that week. He carried no bag. He had a folded copy of the Los Angeles Times under his left arm, the afternoon edition, with a headline about the Apollo 16 launch preparations. His hair was thick and black, combed back without a parting. His eyes were the most still eyes I had ever seen on a human face. Not sad, not happy, still. The way a deep well is still at midnight when you drop a coin and wait for the sound. He was checking out of room 412 that afternoon. He had been at the Hilton for 3 nights. He had checked in under the name Mr. Lee. No first name, no profession on the registration card, no forwarding address. He had paid in cash. He had taken his meals in his room. He had asked the chambermaid not to clean his room more than once during his stay. I did not know who he was. I would not know who he was for another 2 weeks, when the Big Boss opened at the Pix Theatre on Hollywood Boulevard, and I saw his face on the poster and felt my knees go soft. But on the afternoon of the 11th of February, 1972, he was, to me, simply a polite Chinese gentleman from room 412 who had come down to the lobby to check out. He had pressed the call button on floor 4 at 3:18 and 38 seconds. He had been waiting at the elevator for 3 seconds when the doors opened. What he saw when the doors opened was this. A small woman with dark hair pulled back, her left sleeve pushed up to her elbow, her right wrist extended toward a man in a brown jacket, whose hand was 3 centimeters away from her bracelet. Her face was white. Her shoulders were squared in a way that I recognized later in old films, as the way she stood in scenes where her character was being threatened. The man in the brown jacket looked up. He saw the small Chinese gentleman standing in the doorway. And here is what the small Chinese gentleman did. He stepped into the elevator. He did not hesitate. He did not look surprised. He did not say anything. He stepped in, turned to face the doors, and pressed the button for the lobby. He stood between Elizabeth Taylor and the man in the brown jacket. The doors closed. The elevator began to descend. I am going to tell you what happened in the 6 seconds between floor 4 and the moment the man in the brown jacket began to cry. I was not in the elevator, but I have what the small Chinese gentleman told me in the lobby 7 minutes later, and I have what Elizabeth Taylor told me in 1985, 13 years after the fact, and the two accounts agree on every detail. I trust them. They were the only 2 adults in the world who knew exactly what happened in those 6 seconds, and they both, separately, decades apart, told the same 25-year-old bellhop the same story. Second one. The doors closed. The elevator began its descent. The small Chinese gentleman stood with his back to the doors, facing the man in the brown jacket. Elizabeth Taylor was now behind him, against the walnut paneling, her wrist still extended, the bracelet still half unclasped. The man in the brown jacket looked at the small Chinese gentleman. He was confused. He had expected a stranger to step out at floor 4, not in. He had expected to have the rest of the ride to himself. He said, in English, to the small Chinese gentleman, "This is a private conversation." Second 2. The small Chinese gentleman did not answer. He looked at the man in the brown jacket. His eyes did not move. His feet did not move. His hands hung loosely at his sides, the right hand empty, the left hand still holding the folded copy of the Los Angeles Times. He just looked at the man. Elizabeth Taylor told me, in 1985, that she had never in her life seen anyone look at another person the way the small Chinese gentleman looked at the man in the brown jacket in that second. She said it was not anger. It was not threat. It was not warning. She said, it was the way a doctor looks at an X-ray when he sees something the patient does not yet know about himself. Second 3. The man in the brown jacket said, I said, "This is private. Get off at the next floor." He took a half step forward. His weight shifted onto his front foot. His right hand came up, fingers curled but not quite into a fist, somewhere between a fist and a grab. The small Chinese gentleman still did not move, but he spoke for the first time. In English. His voice was quiet, not soft but quiet, the way a closing door is quiet. He said one sentence. "You have written 14 letters that were never opened. Why would the 15th be different?" The man in the brown jacket stopped. Second 4. I have to pause here because I need you to understand what just happened. The small Chinese gentleman had been in the elevator for 2 seconds. He had not spoken to Elizabeth Taylor. He had not looked at the bag on the man's shoulder. He had not seen the notebook, the clippings, the letter. But he had said the number 14. He had said letters. He had said, never opened. He had read, in 2 seconds, in a falling elevator, with no information except what he could see on a man's face and shoulders and hands, the entire shape of what was happening. He had understood that the man in the brown jacket was not a thief. He was a writer who had not been answered. And the bracelet was not the point. The bracelet was a substitute for the answer. Elizabeth Taylor said, in 1985, he spoke to the man as if he had been reading his diary for a year. I do not know how he did it. I have thought about it for 13 years. I will think about it for the rest of my life. Second 5. The man in the brown jacket lowered his hand. She did not speak them aloud. She mouthed them, the way a person mouths something across a crowded room when speaking would be the wrong thing. And he nodded. A single nod, no smile, no wave. And she walked across the lobby and into the elevator on the north bank and went up to suite 904. The man in the brown jacket came out next. He was still crying. He was not making a sound, but tears were still moving down his face, and his canvas messenger bag was hanging open at his side, and he was looking at the marble floor of the lobby as if he had never seen marble before. The The small Chinese gentleman walked beside him. He did not touch him. He walked beside him, as if escorting him, but without contact. They crossed the lobby together, the small Chinese gentleman half a step behind, and they sat down, both of them, on the long velvet bench beneath the painting of the Hollywood Hills. They sat there for 4 minutes. I do not know what was said. I was at the bellhop station, calling Pemberton off the phone with security, telling him, I do not know exactly why I told him this, but I did, telling him that the situation had resolved itself and the police did not need to come. After 4 minutes, the small Chinese gentleman stood up. The man in the brown jacket stayed seated. He had taken something out of his messenger bag, a 4-page, handwritten letter, folded in thirds, and he was holding it in both hands, looking at it. Then he tore it in half. Then he tore it in half again. Then again. He tore it 11 times in total, until the pieces were the size of stamps. He put the pieces in the ashtray on the table beside the bench. He stood up. He walked out of the Hilton through the Wilshire Boulevard entrance. He never came back. I never saw him again. The small Chinese gentleman walked over to my bellhop station. He stood in front of me. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Did you call the police?" I told him I had asked the front desk to, but I had stopped them. He said, "Good. He does not need the police. He needs someone to answer his letters. The next one he writes, someone will." I asked him what he meant. He smiled, a small, tired smile, the only one I ever saw on his face, and he said, "Some men are dangerous because they want to be feared. Some men become dangerous because they want to be seen. The two are not the same. The first kind needs the police. The second kind needs a chair and someone who will sit down." He handed me a folded piece of hotel stationery. It was folded into quarters. He had been holding it in his left hand. He said, "Please give this to Miss Taylor. Not now. When you next see her in the lobby. There is no hurry." I took it. He tipped his hat to me. He was not wearing a hat, but he made the gesture anyway, 2 fingers to his temple, and he walked out through the Wilshire Boulevard entrance and turned left and disappeared into the afternoon light. I never saw him again either. I gave Elizabeth Taylor the note 3 days later. She came down to the lobby on Monday the 14th of February, Valentine's Day as it happened, at 9:20 in the morning to wait for her car. She was wearing the grey wool coat again. She saw me. She walked over. She said, "You were there." I said, "I was, ma'am." She said, "The gentleman, did he leave a name?" I said, "No, ma'am, he left this." I gave her the folded piece of stationery. She unfolded it in front of me. I saw what was written on it. 6 characters. Not 6 letters, 6 handwritten Chinese characters in dark blue ink, in a hand so steady it looked printed. Beneath the characters in English was written one word: "Listen." That was all. Elizabeth Taylor looked at the note for a long time. Then she folded it carefully, twice along the original creases, and she put it into the inside pocket of her grey coat, the pocket over her heart. She looked at me. Her eyes were the famous violet that everyone in Hollywood had described, but in that morning light, they were almost grey. She said, "Tommy, that is your name, isn't it? Tommy?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Tommy, please do not tell anyone about Friday." I said, "No, ma'am, I won't." She said, "Thank you." And she walked out to her Cadillac and went wherever she was going that Monday morning, and that was the last conversation I had with her until 1985. I want to give you the happy ending now, because there is one, and you should have it. The man in the brown jacket, I learned his name later, but I'm not going to say it here, because he is, as far as I know, still alive, and his name is not the point of this story. The man in the brown jacket went home that afternoon. He did not stalk Elizabeth Taylor again. He did not write to her again. He did not appear in any police record connected to her name in the 54 years since. I learned, through a roundabout path involving a friend of a friend who worked in the records department of a Los Angeles County clinic, that he checked himself into a psychiatric outpatient program 11 days after the elevator. He stayed in that program for 19 months. He worked, afterward, as a copywriter for a small advertising firm in Long Beach. He married in 1979. He has 2 daughters. He is, by all accounts I have been able to gather, a quiet and decent man who keeps to himself and who has never spoken publicly of what happened in February of 1972. I do not know whether he remembers the small Chinese gentleman. I suspect he does. I suspect a man does not forget the 4 minutes he spent on a velvet bench in a hotel lobby with the one person in the world who saw him clearly when he could not see himself. Elizabeth Taylor kept the note. I know this because in 1985, when she saw me in that Beverly Hills restaurant and asked me to sit down at her table, I was 40 by then, still a bellhop, off duty, having a sandwich at the counter. She opened her purse and showed it to me. The same folded piece of Hilton stationery. The blue ink had not faded. The crease lines had softened from being unfolded and refolded many times. The English word listen was still readable. She said, I carried this through 3 more marriages. I carried this through Richard's death. I carried this through every press conference, every premiere, every benefit, every hospital stay. I have not opened it on a good day in 13 years, Tommy. I open it on the days when I forget that the world is mostly people trying to be heard. She told me she had learned, in 1973, from a column in the Hollywood Reporter about Bruce Lee's death, that the small Chinese gentleman from the elevator and Bruce Lee were the same man. She said she had wept for a full hour when she put the 2 faces together. She said she had written a private letter of condolence to Linda Lee that summer, by hand, 4 pages, and had never told anyone she sent it. She told me one more thing. She said that the 6 Chinese characters at the top of the note translated to, the bracelet is on the wrist, the voice is in the chest. It was a line, she had learned, from a classical Chinese poem of the Tang dynasty. She had memorized the poem. She had recited it, she said, on every opening night for the rest of her career, in her dressing room, alone, before walking out to face the lights. She said it was the most useful gift anyone had ever given her. She said, Tommy, I have been given a lot of gifts. I have been given diamonds. I have been given paintings. I have been given houses. I have been given love by men who knew how to love and men who did not. But the most useful gift I ever received was a folded piece of stationery from a man whose name I did not know for a year. He did not save my life that day. The man in the brown jacket would not have killed me. He would have taken the bracelet and run. The small Chinese gentleman saved something else. He saved the part of me that would have spent the next 10 years afraid to step into an elevator alone. She paid for my sandwich. She kissed me on the cheek. She left. I never saw her again in person. I saw her on television many times over the next 26 years. I saw her at galas, at award shows, at AIDS fundraisers. She became, after her friend Rock Hudson, one of the great fighters for AIDS research in this country. I saw her at the Vatican meeting the Pope. I saw her on every magazine cover, and every time I saw her, on television or in a magazine, my eyes went to the same place. The inside left pocket of whatever coat she was wearing, over her heart. I do not know if the note was always in there, but I believe it was. The Beverly Hilton lobby is being renovated. The South Bank elevator was lifted out by a crane on the 3rd of April this year. I stood across Wilshire Boulevard and watched it go. The brass panels were sold to a collector in Pasadena. The walnut paneling, including the back wall, with the small knot in the wood at chest height that I had stared at 10,000 times, was donated to a film prop warehouse in Burbank. I drove out to that warehouse last week. I asked if I could see the panel. The young man who runs the warehouse, he was very kind, very patient with an old man in a tan coat asking strange questions. He walked me through 3 aisles of stacked theatrical sets and movie props until we found it. The back panel of the South Bank elevator from the Beverly Hilton Hotel, leaning against a shelf of fake books from a 1980s sitcom. The knot in the wood was still there, chest high, the size of a quarter. I put my hand on it. I stood there for a few minutes. The young man went and got a chair for me, because I am 79 and my back does not stand for long anymore. I sat in the chair, in the warehouse in Burbank, with my hand on the back panel of the elevator, where a small Chinese gentleman had once stood between a movie star and a man who needed to cry. And I said the thing out loud that I have been holding in my chest for 54 years. I said, "Thank you, sir." The young man, he thought I was talking to him. He said, "You're welcome." I did not correct him. He was a kind young man. Some thanks are for everyone who happens to be standing nearby when you finally say them. I drove home to my apartment in Burbank. I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea and looked at the lemon tree in the parking lot. I want to tell you, before I finish, what I learned from that afternoon in February of 1972. I learned it slowly, over 54 years, and I'm not sure I have it right even now. But here is what I think. Most of us, when we walk into a room where something is going wrong, do one of two things. We freeze or we shout. I froze that afternoon until the elevator doors had already closed. I am not proud of it. I have made my peace with it. The small Chinese gentleman did not freeze and did not shout. He stepped in. He stood between. He spoke quietly. He listened to a man whose mouth had not yet opened, and he heard the thing the man could not say. I do not know how he did that. I am 79 years old, and I still do not know. But I know what he taught me. In the 4 minutes I watched him sit on a velvet bench in the lobby of the Beverly Hilton with a stranger who was crying. He taught me that the most useful thing a person can do when they walk into a room where something is going wrong is sit down. Sit down. Don't run. Don't shout. Don't call the police, not yet. Sit down. Look at the person who is breaking. Listen to what they are trying to say with the part of their body that is not their mouth. If the situation needs the police, you will know in 30 seconds. If the situation needs a chair, you will know in 3. He knew the difference. He knew it in 2 seconds, in a falling elevator, with a movie star on one side of him and a stranger on the other, and no information except what he could read from the surface of a face. I do not have his name on my lips when I think about him anymore. I have, instead, a folded piece of stationery I never owned, carried in the coat pocket of a woman I never knew well, over a heart that beat for 79 years and gave more than it ever took. The bracelet was on the wrist. The voice was in the chest. Thank you for sitting at my table. Thomas Callahan, Burbank, California.